Hello. So first of all, apologies for my voice. I've been really unwell, and I'm just recovering, so I haven't quite got my voice back completely yet. So apologies for that in advance. So I'll be uploading our Halloween special podcast tomorrow, along with my Halloween house that I decorated for Halloween in ESO. Yeah, even though my Halloween house does have a story to it, because all of my houses tend to, it's going to be quite vague in the video. So it will actually be interesting to see if anybody can guess what the story to the house is. It's kind of obvious, I feel. Instead of making a story house, I thought I would actually redo a couple of excerpts of my book. So, as some of you may or may not know, I'm currently in the process of preparing a pitch for my book to send to literary agents. I've been writing it for a few years now, and yeah, I think I finished around 6 months ago now, I think. But it's been gone through lots of revisions and beta readers and feedback and stuff like that. It's not a horror novel, but there are a few places in the book that have kind of creepy elements to them. So I thought I'd read a couple of creepy excerpts from my book. I've never read any of my book out loud to anybody. The only people that have seen it have been a few beta readers. So yeah, it's kind of scary to read it, my own writing. But yeah, I thought it would be suitable for Halloween. And I'm also very excited about my book. So yeah, I will probably be making a video when the book is available to purchase. But yeah, my book is called Finding Fire, and it's the first in a series of 4, the second of which I've actually almost finished writing already. Yeah, and there are a couple of creepy moments in the story which I thought would be suitable to read for Halloween. Tobias had been walking for 8 days. He had stopped by a stream for a drink twice, but had not eaten and dared not sleep, for what awaited him in his dreams was surely wicked. The shadows had returned each night, when the sun fell from the sky, plunging the world into unnatural blackness. He could hear them, feel them, smell them. He forced his heavy feet onward, trying his best to pay them no mind, but they kept his pace, sliding through the darkness with a perverse sort of grace, whispering to him, beckoning him. He couldn't say what time it was when he eventually ran into somebody else on the road, but the sun was low, its amber glow pouring over the barren landscape. It was actually several somebodies, a group of Amoan elves, with a camp set up by the side of the dirt track. The Amoa have never particularly liked humans, but with much of their business coming from human towns and cities, they remained largely indifferent. They have always, however, held a reputation for being con artists and thieves, so Tobias hugged his book to his chest as he drew closer to the merchants, who were all watching his approach with cautious interest. "Good day, sir," one of the elves spoke as Tobias shuffled quickly past them. He didn't look up, but nodded in their direction. "Wait, sir." Tobias sighed inwardly as he looked up to meet the gaze of the young elf. He was tall and skinny, his gangly limbs flailing in an awkward and exaggerated greeting, reminding Tobias of a startled spider. The boy stood up straight as their eyes met, and he cleared his throat, his expression anxious. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Tobias wanted to say no, because although he felt physically fine, his mind was not easy. Rather than voice this to a complete stranger, he opted for a nod instead. The boy glanced at the rest of his group with concern etched upon his youthful skin, and within moments an older man stood at his side. "You look weary, traveller. Would you care for something to eat?" Tobias shook his head. "Or perhaps you would like to browse our wares. We have a pack that might come in handy. Your book looks old and heavy. You wouldn't want it destroyed if it rains, I'm sure." Tobias considered this for a moment. A pack did sound like a good idea. He He fished around in his pocket and pulled out some coins. He had 5 gold, 7 silver and 8 pennies. "I'll browse your wares," he said. The old elf led Tobias into a tent where their wares were displayed upon a colourful knitted blanket. Most of the items were useless things: goblets, jewelries, figurines, baubles. His eyes found the pack and he picked it up to inspect. It was a fine bag, sturdy brown leather with several pockets, certainly large enough to hold the book and keep it safe from the elements. He was about to ask how much the elves wanted for it when he spotted the dark hooded cloak hanging upon a chair beside the blanket. He was aware that his madness was starting to seep through his mind and alter his physical appearance. That much was made clear when the young Omoan boy had looked upon him with fear in his eyes. The cloak would certainly prevent unwanted attention. "How much for the pack and the cloak?" Tobias asked, turning to look upon the elf, who took a step backwards as their eyes met. 8 gold, the man replied. Tobias looked again at his meagre coins. "I don't have enough." "Let me see your ring." The elf gestured to the gold ruby-studded ring, which hung upon a chain around Tobias's neck. It had belonged to his grandmother. It was all he had left of her. He sighed as he lifted the chain over his head and handed it over. The elf inspected the ring and shot Tobias a grin. "For this ring you may have the cloak and the pack," he said. Tobias frowned as he considered the offer. A season ago, nothing could have forced him to part with such an heirloom, but it seemed insignificant at that moment. "I'll even throw in a dagger," the elf continued, realizing that Tobias was hesitant. "You can never be too careful on the road." Tobias nodded. "Excellent," the elf beamed, pocketing the ring. As they emerged from the tent, Tobias donned the cloak and put his book and the dagger into the pack before slinging it over one shoulder. "Please stay for some food, sir," the elf insisted. "I mustn't. I'm in a hurry and still have a long journey ahead." "I mean no offence, but you look terribly unwell. Join us for some soup and ale, at no extra cost, of course." Tobias thought on the kind offer for a moment. He didn't feel hungry. The emptiness in his belly was no bother to him at all. But he did feel decidedly weak, so perhaps some food and the pleasant steel of ale would do him some good. He nodded with a small forced smile. "Come, take a seat by the fire and warm your bones." The older man, whom Tobias assumed to be the leader of this particular Omoan group, gestured, making his way over to the fire where the rest of his people sat. Tobias took a seat upon the ground and crossed his legs as the older man handed him a bowl. He tipped his head in thanks and began to sip at the warm broth. He wasn't hungry, but the warmth of the fire and the soup sliding down his throat made him realize how cold he had been. "Where are you travelling to, stranger?" A female elf who sat opposite, just about visible through the flames, regarded him. Tobias swallowed and lowered his bowl. "I'm on my way to Elara." "From where?" "Aylesbury." He wondered whether the sigh in his voice could be heard. He didn't feel like talking. "That's quite the distance to travel, with nothing on your person but an old book." She almost sounded as though she were accusing him, although of what Tobias could not say. "Leave the man to eat in peace, Lena," the old man returned and handed a mug to Tobias, before taking a seat by the fire himself. "Bo was about to tell us a story," the female, Lena, continued. "Perhaps it would be best if we wait until our guest is on his way," the older man replied, blowing gently over his hot soup before taking a sip. "Do our elven tales offend you, Dinor?" Lena's eyes fixed upon Tobias once more. "No." Tobias shook his head before taking a drink. "Which tale would you like to hear?" A red-haired elf to Tobias's left, whom he assumed to be Bo, asked. "Elara and the Drac," a voice called out. "No, I want to hear about Aracel and the blacksmith," came another. Bo held up his hand to quieten his eager listeners. "Let's allow our guest to decide." Tobias wasn't sure why he said it. Perhaps it was curiosity, a wonder at how much the elves knew. Maybe he was hoping for clues, anything that could help to rid him of his blighted curse. Or perhaps he was just a masochist. "Soldier-an," he muttered. "I would like to hear a soldier-an." Bo raised an eyebrow, a wide grin spreading across his face. "The tale of Soldier-an is one of my favourites." He emptied his mug before scanning the circle of elves. A long time ago, so long ago that time held no name, Soldiran lived side by side with the other gods in the white palace of Van Azure. He would put on a facade, pretending to smile at their words and laugh at their jokes, but inside a deep rage was brewing. You see, Unias had forbidden Soldiran from using his powers to influence the world. For too many turns he had sat upon his throne, feeling useless and powerless, and so he decided to speak with Unias. Soldiran pleaded with her, swearing that he would only ever use his magic for good, but Unias shook her head. No good can come from your magic, my brother, for if my magic is as white as snow, yours is as black as night, was her reply. Soldiran went to Putius, the vengeful god of promises, who had also been forbidden to use his magic. So angered were they both, that they decided to work together and against Unias, whatever the cost. Their revolt began in the south. Soldiran's dark magic seeped from his form, tainting the very land as he went. His rage was enough to set entire forests alight, and his darkness was so forceful that it gripped men in its wake, corrupting their souls simply for being too close. Putius was no better. Each whisper of a wish made throughout Sathrion was granted on the spot, and wishes made in the mind during times of passion can be foolish, dark. They are rarely things one truly desires. By the time the two of them had made it to the north, they had decided to mock Unias with their misdeed, and so built mountains from the bodies of those whose lives they had taken. Too many lives, enough to create all of the mountains in Sathrion. Unias was so enraged at their wickedness, she didn't even call a meeting. She stripped Soldiran and Putius of their magic, and banished them from Van Azure. She didn't deem this punishment enough, though, for the evil they had shown, and so she blinded them, taking their eyes and hiding them in the mountains, so that they would forever be forced to look upon their atrocities. Ugh, I don't know why you love that story so, it's hideous, Lena groaned. That's why I told the short version. The full tale is far more gruesome, too gruesome for most of you, I would imagine, Bo grinned. I don't know how you can even say his name, Lena shuddered. There's no weight in a name, Lena. Besides, Soldiran was banished long ago. Tobias wanted to tell them that they were wrong, that their story couldn't possibly be true, but he didn't. Not only was his voice an effort to invoke as of late, but he knew better than to disrespect the hospitable Amoan's beliefs. He emptied the dregs of ale at the bottom of his mug and rose to his feet, removing a gold coin from his pocket and pressing it into the palm of the older elf who had sold him the pack and the cloak. "Thank you," was all he said, forcing a smile that probably looked more like a painful grimace. "Many thanks for your business, sir," the elf replied with a small wave. The older elf and the younger, ganglier one stood in the road watching Tobias depart, the frowns never leaving their faces. As Tobias continued, feeling lighter with his new pack, he noticed the dark looming shapes stretching across the sanguine landscape. The sun was setting. He was only 6 days away from Eleanor, and consoled himself with this thought as he picked up his pace, waiting for night to fall and the shadows to return and torment him once more. It was a shrill and eerie scream that woke me, a woman's scream, only I had no other women in my group. I sat up as Jaren poked his head into my tent. Something strange is happening. His eyes were wild and his skin pale and clammy. He looked as though he had seen a ghost. I could hear muffled mumbles and shouts from the others on either side, and got up sleepily, stepping out into the raw darkness. The fire was no longer burning. It wasn't even smouldering as it should have been. I sobered from my wakening haze instantly and conjured a small orb of flames in order to inspect my surroundings. Almost instantly, another high-pitched shriek pierced through the night, and a shape darker than the darkness itself rushed at me. My own scream escaped as my flames were swallowed by shadows. "Naya, are you all right?" Jaren sounded frantic. I could hear the rustle of fabric behind me as some of my men began to step out of their tents. I turned but couldn't see them. I couldn't even see my own hand where I held it up in front of me. The moon was full. It should not have been so dark. "What's going on?" It was Several's voice. I ignored both questions. "Who's out there?" I called into the black void of the night. Silence. "Several, get the fire!" The dead fire danced swiftly back to life, and several of my men created their own orbs of flame in order to light up the camp. At that moment there was a low, bellowing sound. It was almost deafening, and many of the others put their hands over their ears in an attempt to drown it out. "What is that?" I shouted over the fading drone. "A boat?" I could see the creases of a frown between Jaren's eyebrows as he looked out into the unknown. Who would be fool enough to sail a boat at this time of year? A boat meant one of two things, the Honish or the Dynal. The noise had stopped, but its echo still bounced around inside my skull as I took a few steps forward. I could hear another noise then, steel upon steel, the sound of swords. I took a few more steps, and heard the sound repeated, overlapping the first, and then, as I continued forwards, another. "Do you hear that?" Jaren remained at my side, scanning the area around us as he released another orb of fire. I didn't respond. I just carried on walking slowly into the blackness. A cry of pain pierced through the darkness to my left, and I spun in time to see an elven man fall upon the snow. "Shit!" I knelt by his side. "It's okay." My voice shook. I noticed his wound, deep and bloody in his chest, a couple of ribs visible through the tear in his armour that was almost certainly Honish. "Help me, will you, Jaren?" I asked in irritation as I turned to look at him. He stood watching me blankly. "We need to get him to camp or he'll die," I pleaded. But when I looked back, the Honish soldier was gone. Where did he go? I stood up looking around, confused. There was nobody there, Naya. Jaren placed a hand upon my shoulder. "There was," I spoke with determination, as I shrugged his hand away. My voice raised so that it could be heard above the sound of swords and cries, which were getting louder with each passing second. The sounds of battle. I looked back to where the soldier had lain. "You see?" I pointed at the bloody stain upon the snow. "Naya?" Jaren looked down, turning so that he could observe the ground on all sides. I followed his gaze, to see that the snow was a deep crimson all around us. Then I heard the shrill feminine shriek once more, and there was that shadow again, hurtling towards us. "Run!" We rushed as one back to the camp, which glowed with the feeble light of a few sparse fire orbs. The main fire had died once again. I could hear the thing behind me, shrieking and making a low gurgling sort of noise. My heart thumped hard and fast in my chest, and I could feel the trickle of cold sweat between my shoulders. Fear. We were almost back with the others, and it was so close to me now that I could feel the weight of its darkness. I turned and dodged to the side as it collided with our tents, and then seemingly vanished as something invisible began to hurl our belongings about camp, tearing the tents to shreds like an unseen dagger, and throwing their remnants into the unnatural darkness. My men ran from where they had been standing in front of their tents, their beds for the night now in pieces and scattered all around us. One by one, the orbs of fire vanished, as though they were being eaten by the night. I swallowed hard. My mouth was suddenly parched, and my breath was a frozen lump in my throat. What was happening? "To the south, everyone!" I yelled unsteadily, creating another orb and starting to run. "What about our things?" somebody asked in a panicked voice. "What's more important to you?" I shouted over my shoulder, picking up my pace as I started to hear the noises of battle all around me again. "Your belongings or your life?" As we ran, I could make out that low gurgle once more, and I heard a shout from one of my men. I stopped for a second and looked back. The line of men was barely visible in the darkness, but again the fire mages were of great help, their orbs sticking close by their sides. It took several," somebody stammered. "Keep moving," I shouted back, my voice wavering as I turned to run again. I tripped on something and fell face down upon the cold ground that cushioned me with an eerie crunch. A body, a Dynal soldier laying lifeless upon the crimson snow. I stood up swiftly and continued forward. "What's going on, Naya?" Jaren was at my side. "I don't know," I huffed a sigh, trying not to think about several. But then there was another shout, and I turned in time to see two more men, seemingly plucked from the ground and pulled into the black. I held back a cry of my own. "Hurry!" I shouted back in desperation to those who remained, and picked up my pace. whilst checking the ground, weaving in and out of bodies, both Honish and Dinah. Our sprint was like a crawl to Jaren and myself. As air mages, we could both have been out of there in a flash, but I didn't even contemplate it. I would not abandon my men, and neither would he. Eventually the sounds of battle faded until there were no more than distant echoes. I scanned the ground. The snow glistened in the moonlight, white and clean. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath. I think we've lost whatever that thing was. No sooner had those words escaped my lips, that shriek could be heard once more, piercing the night with its malice. We looked up to see the blackness of the unknown creature rush in our direction, but then halt, hovering like a spectre just meters away, an invisible wall seemingly standing in its path. I gazed upon it properly then, seeing its atrocious face for the first time. It was both a woman and not. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck prickle as I looked into those hideous eyes, which held 1,000 emotions. Grey, lifeless flesh clung to her bones, hanging repulsively in moist tatters. The smell of dead things emanated from her, making my stomach roll. She screamed again, in anger or pain, perhaps both. Her mouth opened, possibly wide, a jawless yawn, revealing black nothingness within. Moments later she turned and sped back into the night as quickly as she had appeared. I'm not sure how long we all stood there, silent and unmoving, but a number of moments passed before I spoke. Let us get away from this place. I led the way swiftly to the east, trying not to think about the 3 men I had lost. Good men, family. I had no idea what had occurred at that camp, but what I did know was that the Honish and the Dinah had not fought on the mainland for a great many years. Was it ghosts we had seen, or something more sinister? I tried to clear my head and think about the plans that lay ahead at Winter's Pass, but it was futile, and as I looked back at the others, I knew the same torment was plaguing everybody's minds. What was that creature, and what had it done to our brothers? Thank you ever so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that you have a wonderful Halloween. Good night.